Hello everybody, and a very warm welcome here to the Australian Institute of International Affairs, New South Wales, on a rather lovely but chilly Sydney night. Good to see you here and to welcome our online audience. We'll be following our usual pattern tonight. Our speaker will run for about half an hour, and we're then going to have a brief comment on the address by one of our interns, followed by the usual period of questions and answers. Our speaker tonight, Dror Doron, is a senior political analyst specialising in geo-strategic developments and their impact on national security issues. He's worked for 17 years for the Israeli government in and out of Israel itself, but for the past several months has begun a new life here in Australia. It's a great pleasure to welcome you tonight, Dr. Doron. Over to you.
Thank you very much for everybody attending. I'm kind of excited. As Ian mentioned, I'm recently arrived to Australia after spending 17 years of career in the Israeli government, doing strategical thinking, strategical planning, exploring strategical events and implications, mainly in the Middle East. As a few months ago, I arrived to Australia, I find myself all of a sudden in the southern hemisphere, in the Indo-Pacific arena, and trying to make sense of that new sphere of competition. What I found is that there are similarities in the challenges that Israel and Australia face when it comes to the global and regional competition it is facing. Each region in the Middle East and in the Indo-Pacific faces one major regional rival or actor which is trying to challenge the status quo. In the Middle East, it is Iran, which is the main focal point of the Israel strategical thinking. In the Indo-Pacific, of course, it is China, which is the main focus of many actors in the region, trying to understand exactly what are the Chinese aspirations and what is the regional future. So there is some kind of resemblance. In each region, one rival, one entity. There are a lot of differences between Australia and Israel. Numerous, size, historical background, political, and the structure of the political regime. I will point on a few, which, from my point of view, are relevant to the strategical overlook of the region and how those governments, how those two countries face the regional challenges. One difference, critical for this kind of discussion when it comes to strategy, is Israel's multiple immediate threats on its border. The strategic attention span of the Israeli political leadership, of the Israeli decision maker, is always under attack from events happening either in Lebanon or in Syria or in Gaza Strip or in the West Bank. You name it. It happens on a weekly pattern. Just a few weeks ago, another round of escalation erupted between Israel and militants in the Gaza Strip. I'm not sure even if the global media covered it because it became so routine. But this is part of being a decision maker in Israel. You all the time need to deal with those constant eruptions of violence, threats, and in the horizon, you do have the strategical threat, again, from the Israeli point of view, that's Iran. But you need to divert span of attention from the tactical to the strategical all the time. So that's one point. And I think in Australia, regional stability and border security is in a less imminent, under less imminent threat, and the decision makers of Australia do have the span of attention to think strategically, to think in a 20, 30 years period of time forward, as they actually do. Another major critical difference is the rival, the nature of the rival. In Australia, the rival is not an enemy. China is not an enemy of Australia. It's a rival. It has other interests. There is competition, but China doesn't attempt to take over Australia. Multiple ties economically, culturally exist, diplomatic ties exist. So this is a major difference when it comes to Israel and Iran, which is much more clear what the Iranian goal is. They declare it every other day. Whether you accept it or not, that's a different question. Whether Iran actually wants to destroy Israel, I'm not sure. But nevertheless, these are the rhetorics. There are no diplomatic connections. There are no economical connections. So that's a very dramatic difference between Israel and Australia when it comes to the interaction with either Iran or China, respectively. So differences on the strategic level exist. Again, I'm putting aside the rest of the differences on many other levels. But more interesting from the point of view of strategical thinking and strategical planning are the similarities between Israel and Australia when they confront those rivals, the regional rivals. Australia and Israel, at least from Israel's perspective, are both Western-oriented entities. The background, the historical background of Israel and Australia is connected to Europe. Liberalism, democratic thinking, this is the basic values of those two entities. In that nature, both of those countries are an island nations in a surrounding which is pretty much different from the historical and value base of those two. Israel and Australia, both of them are quite new to the region. Australia's history goes back 200, 250 years ago. Israel's history goes back 100, 150 years ago. They are not a natural part for the existing ecosystem of the communities and the strategical venue in which they operate today. And in those two cases, they are major powers in the new region they came to hold position in. Also, Israel and Australia represent, as I mentioned, the West towards different cultures, different civilizations, if you like. If you want, you can adapt the Samuel Huntington clash of civilization concept. Israel, representing the West, is facing the Muslim civilization represented by Iran. Australia, representing the Western civilization, is facing the Chinese civilization. Again, if you are willing to adopt this kind of thinking, but nevertheless, they are facing two very different historical, value-based countries. Both of these countries, Israel and Australia, have deep dependence on the United States. They are both independent countries, but the decision maker, either in Jerusalem or in Canberra, has limitations on the actions or the decision it can take because of the American connection. Militarily, economically, intelligence, strategically, on so many levels, Israel and Australia can operate by their own, but they always have the dependency on the United States, and they will always have to take into considerations the wishes, the limitations, the considerations that the American administration has at a certain point of time regarding what is willing or acceptable in Washington. It limits the levels of freedom each of these countries have. So that's talking about Israel and Australia themselves. When talking about the rival, so I already mentioned the historical background. There is an historical self-perception, either both Iran and China perceive themselves, rightly so, to be an historical power, with history going back thousands of years ago, to be an imperial force which actually ruled their respective part of the world. Their strategical thinking, in many aspects, represent restoring this power, going back to the natural place that China should have in their own perspective in the world. Having said that, Iran itself also sees the prospect of rebuilding the Iranian imperial influence in the Middle East. That's part of the historical heritage and the historical thinking, which actually plays part when it comes to strategical thinking and strategical goals in those two countries. Those two countries, Iran and China, challenge the status quo. Right now, we're still in a kind of a unipolar world when the United States and its Western allies playing the major part, reshaping politics and regional international activities. Both China and Iran challenge that. They want to restore their old historical position. By doing that, they are active. They are not reacting to the reality, or probably if you will ask them, they are reacting to a reality, but at the present, they shape the reality. They try to challenge it. They work on a different set of norms doing so. What is acceptable by the Western world is something else when it comes to those two countries regarding the norms, the tools they operate in the regional and the strategic realm, military-wise, cyber-wise, human rights, and so on. It's a different set of, different code those two imperial forces are working on. Another mutual resemblance between the two is the perspective of time. And I consider myself and Israel and Australia as part of a Western democratic system where there are elections every few years, regime change, the people in power change. That's not the case when it comes to China or Iran. These two entities think in a very different time perspective. They're planning and thinking years ahead. Modern democratic political leaders need to plan and act and have some kind of results in a 4 or 5 years term. They need to show in the next election some kind of results. This is kind of pressure that allows other countries which think in a decade or a century way of thinking, much more planning space. They can be active in a very slow pace. That maybe in a democracy that in 4 years terms, 4 years your term is over, it's unacceptable. You need to work faster. And nevertheless, those two rivals has the luxury of thinking much forward because of the structure of the regime, because they have this kind of long-term undemocratic way of political system that works in their favor. Another similarity between the challenges Israel and Australia face regarding the nature of the future battleground. It's a global thing. This is a notion that many countries share in the global realm, but land war is practically something of historical. I think this is part of the surprise that the world war was caught due to the Russian invasion in Ukraine. Who does that in the 21st century? That's a way of action which seems to pass off the world. Tanks rolling into another territory. Most wars in the future won't look like that. Stand-off capabilities. Hitting your rival from afar. The importance of space, geographical space, is much, much less than it used to be. You don't need to have a safety zone, a geographical safety zone surrounding you, because it won't help you when it comes to the new capabilities that today's superpowers or regional superpowers hold. For example, cyber. Okay? You don't have to be close to your rival in order to hit him severely through the cyber realm. Again, both Israel and Australia suffer cyber attacks both by Iran and China during peacetime today, as we speak. Supply chain, we talked earlier about those two countries, Israel and Australia, being stationed in a geographical arena, but their true connections need long supply lines, either to Europe, to other countries. That's vulnerability that should be exploited by any other rival. And by the end of the day, ballistic missiles, kinetic capabilities, which just jump over the distances that, again, in the past were kept only for global threats. Today, at least in the Middle East, we already see Iran using ballistic missiles, hitting targets hundreds of kilometers from its borders. And the fact that there is a certain piece of land between Iran and its rivals doesn't mean anything. When you adapt that on a larger scale, with the capabilities China already holds, You should understand that Australia being far enough of China, that's not enough, because China's kinetic capabilities are able to reach Australian soil without the need to get any closer. So these are the similarities. Moving forward, I would like to talk about 5 points regarding the challenges and maybe recommendations and future thoughts about the situation. It is clear that either Israel or Australia wish to have a war with either Iran or China. There is a competition. How do you run a competition without getting into the stage of confrontation? How do you control the escalation, the potential escalation? How do you avoid miscalculations towards a rival, a strong rival, which challenges a status quo that you're enjoying, but not all the way to the point that you will have a direct military confrontation with? That's a challenge both countries need to think about and avoid as much as they can. Clarity. What are the end game goals of the rivals? Strategic clarity, something, again, after arriving to Australia, it became clear to me that it is unclear to the nations surrounding China what is the end goal of the Chinese foreign policy. What does the Chinese really want by the end of the day? And if you don't know what they want, it's very hard to come up with a strategical or some kind of a counter policy, and because you don't know what you're facing. Is it based on internal pressures that the Chinese need to export outside, or is there a real intention by the Chinese to use their immense military force to do something with it? The intentions of the other side sometimes can be understood by viewing the capabilities it's building. If a nation is building a huge army, you should assume those intentions are being translated to capabilities, and one day they will be used. It's not always like that. There are countries or bureaucratic organizations that build power, build infrastructures for the sake of keeping the bureaucratic system working. In Israel surroundings, the most obvious example is Egypt, holding an immense military force for no use, just to keep hundreds of Egyptians on salary. It's especially right when the government is a major employer in a certain country. It needs the public to be busy with something. Building infrastructure, building military infrastructure may be one route to tackle this issue. It's actually an analysis I heard from a Chinese colleague in the past. Like China is building deep water ports all around the world, not for any strategical, long planning of conquering the world and having ports for their unexisting navy at the time, but just in order to export workers to get the economical wheels running. That's an explanation. It's a good one. Nevertheless, sometimes capabilities being built, being presented to the decision maker, might lead to a change in intentions. Once I didn't have those capabilities, I couldn't do anything, so I continue to do what I did in the past. Once my capabilities are changed, are rebuilt, I have new tools to operate that might change the intentions of the decision maker. I don't really know where the Chinese are standing. Do they plan a very long game, building immense military force in order to use it? Or do they build a military force in order to keep the economical cycle in motion just because they need the workforce to work on something? And maybe one day somebody in China would think it's a good idea to actually use it. I'm not sure. How do you react to this status quo challenge that you are facing, either, again, in Iran, in China? What is the correct response, time-wise, and in what is the right intensity? There is one school claiming the danger of a self-fulfilling prophecy is immense. Once you consider somebody your enemy, you start seeing everything he does as a negative, as a risk to yourself, and you react in a certain way that only create a cycle that by the end of the day, you will reach a military confrontation. The self-fulfilling prophecy is a real thing, going historically to First World War and so on. It's easy to see how a dynamic can reach a military confrontation without the intention of any one of the sides. The other side of the equation is responding too late. Responding after the rival already set his chess pieces on the chessboard in a way that you cannot really react because you are entangled in a way that you are so limited in your reactions that the train is already out of the station. And that's a dilemma for the decision maker. In Australia, at least, from what I understand up to now, the decision has already been taken. Changing the military strategy, building capabilities to confront China is already on the way. And the debate between are we playing to the hands of a miscalculation or are we too late to catch a train? Those nuclear submarines will arrive in 2030. The Chinese might act before that. The time issue and the self-fulfilling prophecy dilemma is already happening in Australia. I don't know what the answer is, but it's already there. Another realm which Australia is already struggling with, and I mentioned it earlier, that's cyber. Cyber warfare is happening today. China is operating in Australian network. The unique thing about the cyber is the fact that it's a wild west. There are no norms in cyber offensive. There are no treaties. It's a new tool. The political world hasn't been able to chase and build enough norms and regulations and treaties and agreements about how to use cyber offensive attack. Nevertheless, everybody uses that. It's already happening. So as a country under attack, the main tool you have is to build deterrence. You need to deter the other side. Stop doing that. What is cyber deterrence? How do you construct that? That's an issue, at least in Israel, which is, of course, also under cyber attacks coming from Iran, is a major thing. It's hard to point about, to attribute the fact that somebody actually attacked you cyber. In the international arena, in the international community, you're expected to have concrete proofs that this country or this entity did that to you. When it's hard to prove, when it's based on intelligence which is unshareable or it's impossible to share it with others, and the dilemma of how you create a deterrence in the cyber realm is an immense one. In the Israeli interaction with Iran, a tit for tat kind of policy has become quite a reality based on numerous events happening in Iran and in Israel. In the context, there is a kind of exchange of blows between the two. Is that the right policy to create this deterrence when it comes to Australia's position toward China? I'm not sure, but nevertheless, this is a question not coming up in 10, 15, 20 years. It's happening right now, and it would be interesting to watch how Australia will react to that. Just a couple of days ago, Australia joined a joint declaration by the Americans and the other Five Eyes, pointing at China as being part of an offense, as being responsible for offensive cyber attacks on the alliance. That's a good start. Declaring that somebody is doing the wrong, that's the first step. But does that deter? Does it come with a price? What kind of price can you tag to this kind of activity? That's a question. Moving forward, you can deter your rival by a threat. Wave a big stick. If you do that, I will hit you back. That's one way of building deterrence or restraining the intentions of a rival, especially if you are uncertain of what are the real intentions or what is the end goal of the rival. Another way to restrain a rival is to create positive restraints, to create price or to interact in a way that will make it unreasonable for the other side to attack you. It's much easier when it comes to the Chinese-Australian relationship because there is so much interaction between the two. So using the Australians' power, the Australian tools that it already has when it comes to interacting with China as a restraining factor towards the Chinese negative policy when it's being detected, that's one thing. Creating enough connections, enough interdependencies that it will be wrong from the Chinese perspective to interact with Australia in a negative aspect. It's kind of a honey trap that can be beneficial, and it can create quite a restraining factor on the status quo changing actor. And the last point is building regional coalitions. Of course, when it comes to a regional power or global power as China is, operating alone is far from enough. And we already see this regional competition between Australia and China, Solomon Islands, for example, but nevertheless, much more arenas are open for this competition. And Australia or any other country which wants to win the hearts and minds and have the impact to influence other countries should take part in this race to gain the favor of the hearts with those other countries, preventing the other side to get first. How do you do that? You need to first prioritize. What is more important from your perspective? What are your interests? What are your values that you are willing maybe to sacrifice in order to gain the alliance of a certain country, which is important, but behaves in a way which is unacceptable based on your values. Again, I will give you this Israeli example. Israeli approach Saudi Arabia, not a very liberal democratic entity in the region, because of its strategic importance, the interest of Israel having connection with Saudi Arabia, even though the Saudis tended to act in an unliberal, undemocratic, in a way that values are not really in alliance with the Israeli ones, in order to achieve this kind of alliance against Iran. The United States tried to interact with Saudi Arabia based on values when it came in the incident of the Khashoggi assassination. If you remember a few years ago, the Saudis assassinated a journalist inside the Saudi embassy in Turkey. The American response was based on values. It said that's unacceptable, that's not the way we do, and it pushed back the interest of the of the United States when it comes to preserving Saudi Arabia as an ally, as an entity which has crucial importance when it comes to oil prices, when it comes to Russian and Chinese presence in the Middle East. And this is a price the American administration was willing to pay in order to save or protect or to signal to the rest of the world that values are important, even though by the end of the day, it came with a price of a less tightened alignment between Saudi Arabia and the American administration. So how do you create coalitions with different countries, sometimes sacrificing your values in order to maintain your interests, but doing so while preserving your priorities and making sure that you know what you're doing and you choose to do it in order to achieve something by the end of it. And I think this is what I've prepared, practically on time. And I was trying to adapt strategic thinking and frameworks based on my experience in the Middle East and the Israeli-Iranian interaction, and to see what of it is relevant to the Australian regional competition. Right now it's a competition. Hopefully it won't deteriorate to a military escalation or so in the future. Thank you.
Thank you, Dror. Very, very interesting points. I'm sure they'll provoke quite a bit of discussion. Our next live event here at Glover Cottages will be on Tuesday the 20th of June, when our interns will make their presentations for 5 minutes or so on an international subject of their own choice. But one of our interns can't be with us on that evening, so as an alternative to making a presentation, we've invited Bakar Mohammed to give a similarly short presentation commenting on what we've just heard. Bakar is an undergraduate student at Western Sydney University and a content creator on Middle Eastern affairs in his channel BM Discourse. Bakar.
It was a bit anticlimactic. I'll time myself so that I don't go over time. There's a very nice Arabic proverb that says, إذا كان الكلام من فضة فالسكوت من ذهب, which basically means if the speech was made of silver, then silence is gold. And I think in this instance, I should be silent, but because I have to fulfill my internship, I'll go on and give some remarks. Now, I guess I'm not going to approach this from a geopolitical lens, speaking about where Israel stands, for example, on the geopolitical stage and how it relates to Australia. I think I'd be way out of my scope speaking about that. But I want to take you through a story of someone like myself, an Australian that comes from an Arab background and a Muslim background, that's trying to tap into the space of international affairs. And this dissonance occurs within me. This dissonance where, on the one hand, I see the Australian values aligning quite well with what Israel stands, with where Israel stands in the Middle East. And then on the other hand, there's where I've been raised, where my community stands, where basically everything that's been ingrained in me since I was a child, screaming that Israel is this warmongering devil that's out to grab every Arab and 1, 2, 3. And as I try to tap into this space, I always have these two narratives that are conflicting within me. And as a content creator and someone that tries to write in the international development space on the Middle East specifically, I come across this real difficult challenge, especially when I try to speak to people in my community. Anytime I even mention the name Israel or I speak of Judaism, I'm automatically looked at as like how dare you? It's like Voldemort, like the name that shan't be, like you can't say that name. And so recently I've been trying to explore the story of Israel and the story of Palestine and where a lot of this conflict sort of emerges from. And I've been producing videos that tries to portray each in just their basic historic narrative, where each gets their historic story, like their origin story. And at the end, you see that there's two nations, each having a right to their story, each having quite a correct narrative. But because I think maybe post-World War I, and some might put the blame on the Brits for this with the signing of Sykes-Picot, but then also the agreement with Israel or with the Jews at the time, there was an unfortunate event where two allocated lands just occurred and it was given to two people, and that didn't work very well. And then from then you see this growing hatred that's just ongoing and hasn't really stopped. And because of my interest, I've decided, and I'm a psychology student, so I've decided to look at this, like, where does this stem from? And I guess I'll refer to two studies that we know in psychology, and one of them is called the in-group, out-group effect. And one of the famous studies that we know by a social psychologist was they went into a room, and in this room they decided amongst year 3 or year 4 cohort to divide the room according to the color of the students' eyes. And so they said, in one instance, blue-eyed students are superior to brown-eyed students. And then they observed what happened over the next few days. And what they saw was a natural classroom where friendships were quite strong, where people viewed each other as alike. The room started to split. Hatred started to grow. The blue-eyed kids started to walk into the room expecting the brown-eyed to open the way for them. And this natural split occurred. But then a few days later, that same teacher came back in the classroom and they had a reverse statement, and they said, we actually made a mistake, and brown-eyed kids are superior to the blue-eyed kids. And the exact same effect occurred. They saw the reverse effect, where the brown-eyed kids now saw themselves as superior, and the conflict began to emerge again. And that's a narrative that we see in the Israeli-Palestine issue. And it's something that strikes me it strikes me a lot, because I'm trying to tap into this space and trying to understand both views. But each have their lens. Each are taught this perspective that they're the superior race in some sense, or that their narrative is superior. But really, it's two stories that are unfortunately clashing. The second is what Dror actually referred to with the what's the effect that you referred to? The self-fulfilling prophecy. And that's where the Israeli-Palestine narrative, and I'll end in the next 30 seconds, the Israeli-Palestine narrative is really just a growth of this self-fulfilling prophecy. The Palestinians have this schema of an Israeli, of this warmonger, of this colonizing force. And the Israeli or the Jewish people have this schema of the Palestinian as this dehumanized individual. And this self-fulfilling prophecy occurs where each time they encounter another on the border or in the mosque or the like, that story is reinforced. And we have this study in psychology where social psychologists got elephants and they got them to tow a carriage, as elephants would normally do. And the elephant were trained quite well to do that, and with no issue, as an elephant would, like the strength that they have, right? But what they did a few times was they got a really heavy load and they got the elephants to try towing it, and the elephants failed. And they did this time and time again until the elephants grew this notion of they're actually unable to tow a load anymore. And so when a lighter load was then given to the elephants to carry, the elephants would not move, because they embedded the narrative within them that they aren't able to tow this load anymore. So this self-fulfilling prophecy took place. And if we look at the Israeli-Palestine issue as simply that, these social psychological effects that are taking place, of course, amidst a very messy geopolitical situation, it humanizes the situation. And I'll end with this quote by Rumi, which says, "Beyond right and wrong, there is a field. Meet us there." Thank you.
Thank you, Bakar. We now have the best part of half an hour for questions. I'd like to go first to Richard. Would you mind returning to the lectern?
Thank you very much. Do I think
Yep.
It's coming your way.
I was in Iran when the Shah was in power. At that time, Israel and Iran had very good relations. That hasn't entirely gone. We now have a theocracy. We now have ayatollahs, and we have very extreme politicians in Iran, for example, Ahmadinejad, who said, "I'm going to drive the Jews into the sea." I guess my question relates to, I want to ask you about the JCPOA, the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action, which China and Russia and the European countries, not Israel, but others, got together, and Iran, and decided we will have the most stringent measures, surveillance measures by the International Atomic Energy Agency on Iran. They will have to destroy their enriched uranium-235. A whole string of other things were put in place. I recently went to Iran on a fact-finding tour with some Jewish friends of mine from Melbourne, as well as others. They could not get it through their heads that Iran was not going to attack Israel as soon as they had the bomb. And yet Israel has its own nuclear weapons. You're very coy about them, but you have them. We all know that. You have a force de frappe that could destroy Iran if you wanted to. You talk about China, Australia in the same terms you talk with Israel and Palestine. It's quite Iran and Israel. It's quite a different, and I suggest you, artificial thing. So I ask you, what do you think of the JCPOA? Is Donald Trump's destruction of that ill-advised? Do you think it might come back? Should it come back? Or do you still hold the view that Iran is going to develop the bomb willy-nilly?
That's a long question, and
Yeah.
I'll try to be short. The JCPOA was a break time. It's intended to give the Western world and Israel as part of it a certain period of time, 15 years or 20 years, that Iran nuclear activities will be, as you mentioned, decreased dramatically, but after this period of time, the sunset of the JCPOA would give Iran the legitimation to go back to its nuclear activities. I think, again, and in that aspect, some in Israel, especially the decision maker, thought it's unacceptable because by the end of the day, what the JCPOA was doing was a kind of a break in the Iranian advancement into a bomb, but by the end of the day, it will legitimize Iranian nuclear aspirations. And I think that was the focal point that brought Israeli leaders to object the JCPOA altogether. There is no doubt that after the 2018 American withdrawal from the JCPOA, Iranian advancement in the nuclear realm was immense. But that's another issue. But I think that the core fact that Israel rejected the JCPOA by its essence because it didn't resolve the issue. It just postponed it for a certain period of time, a long one. But nevertheless, it's just a postponement with the legitimation of Iranian nuclear aspiration afterwards. From the Israeli point of view, that's unacceptable because the Iranian nuclear threat is perceived as a threat on the existence of Israel. I agree with you. I'm not sure Iran is going to throw a bomb on Israel the minute they will build the bomb. They don't need to. The leverage that the regime with the nuclear capabilities have will enable Iran to do a lot of other things without threatening to use a nuclear bomb in order to confront Israel in ways that even today Iran is doing. Terrorism, cyber attacks, regional destabilization. It's happening as we speak with the defense mechanism of a potential bomb, of a potential nuclear regional superpower, regional power. That is something which is unacceptable from Israeli point of view. This is why Israel was so harsh in its response to the JCPOA, to the original JCPOA at the time, because it wasn't resolving the problem, it was pushing it into the future, but a future that will meet all of the actors in a very poor situation when the future will come, and it will arrive. What happens after 2018, this future arrived much faster, without any agreement. And right now, I think many decision makers in Israel are scratching their heads, what can we do right now? Instead of reaching this point in 2030 or 2035, it's here now in 2023. And that's a dilemma.
That sounds like the beginning of what could be a very, very long debate. With some analogies with our attitudes to China, we, I think, are learning not to necessarily regard China as a threat. And that might be instructive in terms of your parallels. Do we have a further question? Alison.
Thank you too for your speech. Another question about, I've been out of this country for the last few weeks, and I may have missed something, but could you update us, please, on what happened about the massive demonstrations in Israel about the Supreme Court? And what was if it has been resolved, can you please explain to us what the resolution is? That's question one, if you don't mind, because you may be able to do that very quickly. What position does the government of Israel have about the war in Ukraine? And maybe you can explain that too. Thank you.
Okay. Again, as I'm not an Israeli official in any way or means, I will give you my own perspective as an Israeli citizen. We've had some knowledge about the Israeli decision making and so on. Regarding the internal Israeli strife, it hasn't been resolved. It goes to the basic nature of the Israeli political system, the structure of the regime. Israel is a very fragile democracy. It has three branches, like any normal democracy. the legislative branch, the parliament, the executive branch, the government, and the judicial branch, which oversees both of them. In the practicality of Israel, the coalition in the parliament is also the government. It's a government coalition, so when the prime minister is being elected, and he also controls the parliament. So you have two branches of the regime practically working as one. And the only branch in the regime that can oversee the legislative and the executive branch is the judicial one. What we are seeing right now is an attempt to weaken the restraints, the checks and balances of the judicial system over the two other branches. If that will succeed, Israel might not be considered a democracy by its essence. It may have elections, but the combination of three branches under the same influential political camp, doesn't matter if it's right, left, center, it doesn't really matter, because the separations of power will not exist anymore. It's super crucial in Israel because there is no constitution as well. So the limitation on the executive branch are almost only by the judicial system. When this factor in the triangle of branches will be diminished, something bad will happen in Israel, from my perspective. When it comes to Israel and Ukraine, well, it's much more complex. Israel is facing Russians on its northern border in Syria. There is Russian presence there, Air Force, Navy. The calculations of interests is that Russia on the borders of Israel with its military capabilities is dangerous. Israel is not willing to brush military or to risk military confrontation, escalation with Russian forces in Syria, even in the price of kind of watching what happens in Ukraine, supplying humanitarian aid, defense systems, radars, and so on. No offensive weapons are being sent to Ukraine on account of trying to balance those interests in our northern border and the need, the will to do the right thing when it comes to Ukraine, which is being invaded by a foreign force, again, in a pattern which is reminding something from the past and not modern days.
Just wait for the microphone.
You paint a picture as if Israel is a nice, little, innocent little girl surrounded by all, so devils and beasts. But having said that, one has heard the continuous annexing of Palestinian land and asking for taking on more of their land. Yes, you hit them very hard, and their reply is nothing really, very much. And also, as somebody was saying, the gut reducing of the judiciary. Is there a time where it will become also, as you said, an authoritarian state, not much different from Iran? And if Iran and Saudi Arabia can have a peace treaty with the help of China, is there a chance of having one? But I know that the way you pin as if China is a global threat, but hey, China has become a mediator. Can China help as well on that score? And is there any chance of a two-state solution in Israel?
Okay, again, a complex question. I try to approach it. First, yes, there is a risk of Israel democracy deteriorating into something else. This is why hundreds of thousands of Israelis go to the streets every week for the last 20 weeks. That's the essence of the uprising in Israel, which happens right now. The risk of Israel becoming something else than a liberal democracy. Again, I put the Palestinian issue aside because it's very complex. I think Muhammad touched it. There is a competing national narrative there. It's not a. It's too complex to answer in a short answer, but nevertheless, yes, when it comes to Israel internally, Israel might be falling into something else as we speak. again, the public in Israel is trying to prevent it. As China entering into the Middle East as a positive force, yes, of course. I think the fact that the Chinese doesn't have the moral or the historical background that the Americans come to the table, they became much more acceptable by different actors. It's much easier for both sides to interact with the mediator, which doesn't have a background or suspicious of being aligned with the other side. I think this is part of the thing that played to the hands of the Chinese when they negotiated the Iranian-Saudi. It's not a peace treaty. They are not in war, but the reconstruction of their diplomatic ties, the rivalry between Iran and Saudi Arabia won't be over in the foreseeable future, according to my opinion. It's a religious, ethnic, historical one, but nevertheless, at this certain point of time, the Chinese involvement was very positive in putting down the tension between those two, and both of those countries chose to go with the Chinese initiative based on their own interests and their calculations regarding the risks of continuing the same trend they were for the last 7 or 10 years.
Thank you. Do we have another question? I know I have one. Oh, please.
Thank you. Mr. Fedor, I have a military background, but I have a wider view than the audience tonight. Our national security is determined by our ability to maintain our independence, and your help in developing our agriculture's irrigation has done wonders for that. Your help in our maintaining our cyber security has helped us with that. And your ability to turn the gas that you have found close to you into the straight natural gas into your power stations and then LNG exported all seem to also help your national security. I note that the border between Lebanon and Israel has just been confirmed. Do you think that will get Lebanon more on your side and more away from other people?
Yeah, of course, national security is much wider than military. Military, of course, military is part of it, but social coherence against, I will go back to the demonstration happening right now in Israel. A lot of Israel experts and analysts consider this internal Israeli rift as a risk to the national security of Israel because of the perception of weakness that other countries in the region might take based on these conflicts which happen inside Israel. So national security, of course, is much wider than strategical thinking and military power equations. That's my point of view, because that's the silo I grew in, but of course climate change, energy safety, and agriculture and so on are part of national security. Education, no doubt, thinking forward on the long term, again, not something Israel is very good at, but yes, national security, it's much, much wider than the few aspects I touched here today.
Thank you. Do I see a further question? Right from the back of the room, is it online audience?
Yes, we've got an online question from Adam, and he asks, what are the strategies Israel has in place to handle Iran that Australia can implement to tackle China?
Again, I think it was mentioned here that China is not the enemy of Australia. I think there is a huge difference between what Israel is willing, able, or accepted to do, vice versa Iran. I think it would be a very bad idea for Australia to imitate Israeli policies to Iran and to adapt it to the Chinese, again, competition, not enemy-wise. There are a few points that might stir some thinking, but adapting an Israeli approach onto the Chinese dilemma or challenge, not be a good idea. I must say, Israel as well is facing China or trying to interact with China in a way, but the tools, the means, what is acceptable to apply as a foreign policy are very different than what the Israeli security or international affairs establishment is allowed to do when it comes to Iran. A different ballgame. Again, China is a rival. There is a competition. Everybody should manage it. The potential of war is there because the elements on the chessboard are being placed as we speak, but it doesn't mean it has to go there. Iran and Israel, it's a very different ball game. Declarations of destructions are not something. I hope we will never reach the point that China will threaten Australia with destruction. And it's far, far from that when it comes to the Australia-Chinese relationship.
Any more questions either online or here in the hall? The one I had in mind rose from something you said about Russia in Syria being perceived as a threat. The Soviet Union was the very first country to recognize Israel when it came into being, and now, 75 years later, you have a huge Russian ethnic population. Isn't it rather inconceivable that Russia would be an enemy of Israel in any conflict? And is that related to the very interesting pattern of improved relations that's been occurring between Syria and its neighbours, not without parallels with the improved relations between Israel and Saudi Arabia and other Gulf countries? Complicated, I hope that meant something.
When I mean Israeli calculations towards Syrian military presence in Russian military presence in Syria, I don't mean Russia is going to start a war with Israel or Israel and Russia are going to go into war. And what I mean is Israel today, and for the last 10 years or so, is enjoying what is called the freedom of action in the skies of Syria when it comes to tackling military, kinetically, Iranian presence in Syria. The fact that Israel warplanes are able to fly over Syria, even though Russian air defense system, Russian air force is present in Syria, is a major, I wouldn't call it strategical, but it's a super relevant tactical advantage that Israel has to maintain. As long as Iran is pushing into Syria capabilities that Israel is not willing to accept, and the only way to diminish these capabilities is by military, kinetically attacking them, you need this freedom and action over the skies of Syria. If the Russians will decide not to go to war, just to operate their S-400 surface-to-air missiles, that will eliminate Israeli capability to act in Syria, and that will increase, most probably, Iranian attempts to push forward more missiles, air defense, UAVs, military capability in Syria, and that will change the balance and not in the favor of Israel. In that aspect, Israel is not willing to challenge Russia, is not willing to cross a certain line that might lead Russia in Moscow to order Russian forces in Syria, don't let Israelis fly over Syria anymore. This is something that from the Israeli perspective, that's the top interest. As I mentioned, you need to prioritize our interests, so that this is a prioritizing issue that Israel has taken during the last few years. We prioritize freedom of action over Syrian skies over military assistance to Ukraine against Russia.
Thank you, and it's very clear that we could go on for another half an hour, but time's up. I'm sure you won't mind if a few members of our audience bother you for a few minutes when the formal part of the evening's over. And the formal part of the evening will now end with a vote of thanks to be given by one of our interns, Nadia Monsell.
Okay, I'd like to thank our speaker for coming tonight and giving us a wonderful talk about the similarities and differences between Australian and Israeli foreign policy. I know myself, having done a degree in international relations, that learning about the ways that regional competition can play out and potentially become military confrontation in a worst case scenario is particularly engaging and something that we should all probably think about in our part of the world. So I now propose that we move by applause a move of thanks for our speaker.